We're going to be talking about Excel's text functions. And although SEX is mostly a number crunching program, we also have to type in lists of people, lists of products, lists of dates, and so forth. And many times we spend more time than we need to working with that text to get it into a format that we like. So I'm going to go through a number of different text functions with you. For instance, just to look at the various formulas, and I'm sure you all know there's different categories of formulas. If I look at the text formulas or functions, look at the various numbers of them. So obviously, we are not going to go through them all today in a half an hour or so, but we are going to look at quite a number of them. And actually, the first function I'm going to show you is not even one of directly a text function. It's actually a data function, which will allow us to do some text. Let me see if I can get this out of the way. Thank you. Okay, so for instance, here we have a listing of names, and the names are in upper and lowercase. I'm sorry, they're all in uppercase now, but the point is they're first and last names together in the same cells. And sometimes you get information like this that you may perhaps have imported from another company, or this is the way somebody typed it, and you really need to have them separated first and last names in different columns so that you can sort them more effectively and so forth. The first thing to do if you need to do that is to make sure you have a blank column, because you're going to need another column. So you need another column to the right of that. So I'm going to right-click on column B since I want to separate out column A, and I'm going to just insert another column. If you haven't done that when you start to do your separation, it's going to ask you if you want to overwrite, and then you just have to say no and go back and start again. So I have created that column for us, and if we go and select those names and then go to the Data tab, and in the Data tab you get to a function called Text to Columns, one of the data tools. And so we want to divide that text into columns, and it is a delimited. In other words, it has a character, or sometimes it's more than one, but a character separating the two names, and that is, of course, a space. So we're going to say that we're going to leave it as a delimited, and then we're going to go to the next step in the wizard. And although it says tab, that's just the default. We don't have a tab there. We have a space. And as soon as I hit space, notice how it separates the columns. When I go to next, I would have an opportunity if it was a special kind of data, but this is just general or text would work. And when I say finish, there is my separated names. And obviously I could change the headings and it would do that for all of them. So the first thing we went to look at was not under the text formulas function, but it was under a text to columns function, which allows you to go through a wizard to separate the text. So it is a text function, but it's interesting that it's in under the data. Okay, what if you need to do the opposite of that, and you already have the names separated first and last, but you need to modify them? What that's doing there. Okay, so you need to put them together for some reason. Okay, and maybe you need them together on a different sheet. So I have something called full names here, and I want to put together the name, the first and last name from the other one. And perhaps I would also like to make sure that they're in proper case. In other words, first letter uppercase and rest lowercase, as you normally would write names. So I can use a function, and this is under the formulas and the text, and this is called concatenate. Concatenate brings together information from various text strings in different cells up to 255 separate strings into a single text string, so it can put it into a single cell. So we're not going to do 255, but we are going to create that feature. So we're going to say, okay, this is what I want to do. And in the first text box, I'm going to go here and I'm going to put the first name. And since I need to separate those names from a space, anytime you are putting in characters that are not a cell reference, you need to put them within quote marks. So I'm putting quote mark, a space, and a quote mark to separate the first name from the last name. And then I'm going to go to 3, and notice it'll keep adding more boxes up to 255 if I do need to select such a large area. And then I'm going to pick the second one. I notice here I'm on row 10. I didn't go up to the top, so it won't do them all, but that's okay. And then I'm going to say OK. And so we now have the name, first name, space, last name, but it is not in proper case. So I'm going to go up here into the formula, and I'm going to put in a proper. I'm going to nest proper around this formula. And now we have Barbara DeSatio in a proper case. So I have concatenate and bring in those 2 cells with a space between, and then I've nested that within a proper function. And if I go to the auto fill, I can fill it down from there. Okay, so that was the last one. Okay, so that will allow us to do, that's interesting. That's interesting. I'm not sure. I started it at a weird place and it didn't take me all the way down. Okay, so let's go on. In the user ID, let's just say we want user ID to pull in the first initial and the last name. So that's a little bit different. And I'm going to also use concatenate. So I'm going to go to text and start with concatenate. And for the first text cell, I'm going to use a function that's going to get nested inside called left, because I want to pull out something that's left in this other employee sheet. Okay, so I want to pull out the first character of the first name. Okay, so I've kind of automatically built that in. And then in this case, I don't want a space, so I'm not going to do that. But I want to do the proper function as for the last name. Okay, so if I do that, I'm actually kind of nesting in 2 functions here. And so I get B DeSato, and I can automatically fill that down. So it gives me first initial last name, but only the first letter of the last name is uppercase. So here I have put in a left function to pull out 1 character at the left, and I have put in a proper function to give me proper case for the last name. So that is what we're doing there. Now, also on this requirement sheet, we have a department item here, and if we would like the department to be listed here with a code, department code, if you look at the other sheet, there's a department code here. Now that's why, because I started 10 here. Okay, so it starts with the department code, and then we want a space, and then we want the department name. So just to do an exercise here. So if we go, that would also be concatenate. Now I can always go to formulas and drop down text and go to concatenate, or I could just start typing the function, type the first few characters, and it brings it up. Now, if I knew exactly what I wanted, I could type in the stuff. If I would like to see the dialog box, I can always go to that little FX up here to give me the details. Okay, so if we want to concatenate the department code, and then we want a space, so again, I'm going to do quote mark, space, quote mark, and then in the next text 3, I'm going to go back and say the department name, and then I'm going to say OK, and here we have it. And it's going to just take it down, just need to make this a little wider. And we have what we're calling our department here with the department number and the name. Now, as we did earlier, we pulled out one letter from the left of a field with the first initial. And in the extension, what we're going to do is here we have an office location, and that includes a building, a room, and an extension. So for each of these, the extension is the last 4 characters. So we can use for this one, notice in the text functions, there is a left function, there is a right function, there is a mid function. And as we looked at a proper function, there's also an upper, and here's a lower to make things lowercase, and there's an upper to make things uppercase. So we're going to use a function here in order to get the last 4 characters, because it's always the last 4 characters is the extension in this particular case. So we're going to go to equal, so we're going to do the right. And again, I can just start typing it in if I want, and then I can go to the function box, or I could have gone and to the formulas and drop down text and so forth. So I want to go to the right. I want to go to this sheet. I want to go to the G column, which has the extension that I'm interested in, and you have to tell it how many characters do you want to pull out. Last time it was only 1 because it was the first initial of the name. This time it's 4 because it's the last 4 characters. And when I say OK, there's the extension, and then I can drop it down to get it for everybody. Okay, so those are some other ways that you can work with it. Now, what if I wanted to change these names to proper case right where they're sitting in their same column? I don't want it on another place, but I've already have these names that I loaded in from someplace, and they're uppercase, and I want to change them. So let's say I'll use the first name as an example. First of all, I want to put an extra column next to it so that I'm not overwriting the date of hire in this case. And so what I want to do is use the proper function. So I can go here and say proper, and I want to say here, and then say OK. And so now I have the first name, and when I autofill it, I've got the first names in the right order. Now, if I take this and copy it, all right, and then go over here and paste it, what happens? That's not what I wanted. The problem being that what I'm pasting is a function that says go to one column to my left and put it in proper case. So instead of doing what I wanted, the first name, it's putting the last name because that's the one column to the left. So I'm going to undo that. And instead, what I want to do is take this information and again, copy it. But when I go to where I want to place it, I don't want to just plain paste. I want to paste the value. In other words, I want to paste what the result of the function is, not the function itself. So now I don't have any function when I look at these because I pasted the value, not the function. When I pasted the function, it said take what was to my left and put it in proper case, which resulted in just a copy of the last names. So now I can simply take this and delete it because I had an extra column, and here I do. And I could do the same thing with the last name column, of course, but I'm not going to take the time to do that. Okay, I'm going to call up a slightly different, this also has very similar stuff to it, slightly different. And I'm going to use this, so we're going to be pulling things from this employee list, which has first names, last names, department, and so forth. And we're going to create a report. So here we're going to use Concatenate, but it's going to be a much more extensive use of Concatenate because we're going to put together a report which you might have typed in a Word addendum to your spreadsheet, or you might want to type something that's more like a conversational report, English thing, in your as a spreadsheet in your actual file. So we can use Concatenate to do that if you like. So I'm going to go to Text and Concatenate. And here's where we're going to do a more extensive one. So if we want to say the employee who works in this department and has a phone extension of such and such, we're going to create that like a sentence. So the first concatenation is going to be here. And then the next one, since I'm doing first name, last name, I want to put a space. So I'm just putting quotes around a space. And then I'm going to go and say the first name. Oh, I did the first name twice, didn't I? Now I want the last name. And then I'm going to open up, I'm going to be typing some text, so I'm going to open up a quote and put it to space. So there's a space there. And I'm going to say works in space, end the quote. And then I'm going to go back and tag the department name. And now it looks like I'm out of text spaces here, but I can just scroll down. And I'm going to open a quote and a space. And I say, and has an extension of space, end the quote. And again, scroll down. And I'm going to go back to the employee list. This one has the extension on it. Okay, and if I want to end that sentence properly with a period, I'll go to the next text 8 and I'll quote, period, end quote. And when I say okay, I get a sentence. And if I wanted to take that down, and I purposely pulled it down a little further than the last row 27, which had the last person on my sheet. So row 28 just says works in and has an extension of. But if I go to my sheet and I go to the bottom and go to row 27 and I fill in, you know, Smith, Sam, and I say sales, and I say his extension and so forth. Notice if I go back to the report, here's Sam Smith works in sales and has an extension of. So you can fill this in even before you have all of your names or inventory items or whatever it is filled in, and as you fill them in, the report will be written like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, there's also something called a values function. And we're going to go back to this sheet, and this has some dates here for dates of hire, very old dates, but that's okay, dates of hire. And we're going to look over here and just say in the text we have a function called value. And what the value does is it converts a number's text string, a text string that represents a number, into a number. So you'll see mostly used for dates. So if I then say this and I say okay, I've got all of these dates. You know, I'm sure you're aware that every date we type in actually has a sequential number behind it, starting with January 1st of 1900 is number 1, and it just sequences forward. So this date is 36,297. So if we then take that down, whoops. Okay, so all of those are actually sequential dates. And if I change the format of those cells and I go to date and I pick a much longer date format and say okay, and make that a little wider, we now have the dates in a different format, which might be necessary for some function you have or report you're going to do or whatever. So that's just another example of a function, a text function. And I'm also going to look at one more function that's called trim. And if you notice here, I've purposely put in extra spacing in various places here. And sometimes, again, when you, especially if you're loading stuff in, importing from another program or whatever, you sometimes get extra spaces at the front or whatever. And if you want to modify that, okay, you can use this trim function. So I'm going again to go from the text to a function called trim, and I just tell it what I would like it to trim, and it says it removes all spaces from a text string except for single spaces between words. So if I say OK, and then autofill that, oops, won't autofill because the next column is blank, this blank column. So I have to pull it down, and notice this looks a lot better. Maybe it's easier to see if we make sure that the size is the same. Okay, so I just did a format painter to make sure the size is there. And you can see clearly that some of the things that had extra spaces in them are now nice and neat and put in the way they should be. Okay, I wanted to mention something about one of the things we did earlier, and that is when we worked with the names and separated them. I think the example might have been in the other file. Well, we separated the names into two columns, and that's the result. But if you have middle initials, or if you have a senior or some kind of, you know, the third or something after the name. So in other words, if they're not all consistent with first name space last name, then you need to clean up that list before you do that data. It was when we did the data and text to columns. Okay, I didn't select any, but we did text to columns, and then we just had to say space because all of those names just had first name space last name. But if you did have a middle initial on a few of them, you'd have to, you know, it would want to create a separate column for each time there was a space. So you'd have to clean that up first if you want to be able to use that. So otherwise, I think all the things we went through are pretty clear. Tell me if anybody has, I see there's a chat here. I hope Gail's screen changed. I didn't notice this before, so I wasn't looking in the chat. If there are any questions, you can type in a question. But I do training with individuals as well as with corporate groups. And you can reach me at Ronnie at computertrainingsolutions.biz, B-I-Z, 203-329-2421. And US Computer is the company that I partner with and I'm doing the webinar from, and they do technical assistance to companies, all sorts of tech stuff. So thank you for listening, and